Yo, good morning, buen dia, everybody. Um, I was felt impelled to talk about this particular subject that's basically floating around on YouTube and just all over, social media or whatnot, different platforms. So basically, the last few days ago, right? Um, of course, the rapper Fat Joe had made a very profound statement, right? And basically, he was reaffirming how Latinos, people of Latino or Hispanic or Caribbean ancestry, in fact, have a great amount of African culture, heritage. When you look at Latino cultures, Caribbean cultures, you see a lot of African. Uh, you just see African culture all over it. Whether it's the music, the dance, the dialects, the different Spanish dialects in Latin America. Um, Even the various spiritual traditions. I don't call them religions, but the spiritual traditions. Some, for instance, the Santeria, Haitian Voodoo, Ifa, all of those uh, spiritual systems have their roots directly in Africa, Western Africa. So, for instance, the Santeria and the Ifa was brought to Latin America by the African slaves who mainly came from the areas we now know as maybe Nigeria, Angola, where my African slave ancestors came from. So there's basically a lot of controversy behind Fat Joe's statement because he said that, in fact, from my experience, Latin Americans, Caribbeans, actually have or are connected to our African heritage even more than African Americans. I find that to be true. Being connected to your African culture really has nothing to do with your skin tone, nor just you merely knowing that that you have ancestors from Africa. Okay, we all know that. Latin Americans and Caribbean Latin Americans, we are more directly connected to our African heritage because we weren't completely stripped of our heritages that came from the African slaves. Because, like I said, the African slaves, first we got to start with the history first. The African slave trade started in Americas in the early 1500s, around maybe like 1505, 1506, something like that. Basically, shortly after the Christopher Columbus's voyages to the Caribbean. So now the first African slaves were brought to the shores of the Americas by the Spaniards, the Portuguese, not the British. The British didn't start the African slave trade until 100 years or so later, after the Spaniards, Portuguese, and the French. Okay, so in the early 1500s, 3 to 4 millions of Africans were imported to what's now known as South America, the Caribbean, Central America. Okay, these slaves were brought from different parts of Africa and dropped in different parts of Americas. So these African slaves were brought, okay, to these lands. to work as slaves because the native populations, or what they call the Native American Indians, the native indigenous populations of Latin America and the Caribbean, a lot of them died out after trying to be duped into slavery and um, diseases and so forth, genocide basically. So the Spaniards decided, let's go to bring the African slaves. They perceived the African as a little more physically, to endure, the weather, especially in Latin America, Caribbean, and the southern United States. They were more endure the climate and to work more. So, with that being said, in the Caribbean and Latin America, most of the slaves were they worked the sugarcane fields, versus here in the United States, the slaves worked the cotton fields and tobacco fields, because that was the economy here in the in the southern United States. But in the Caribbean and Latin America, the main farming economies was basically sugar cane. So they tilled the sugar cane plantations. So that being said, these slaves in the Caribbean and Latin America, they still retained some of their languages, and that's where like they spoke in code. They've developed code languages, so that the masters would not be able to pick up on their communication. This is where like Haitian Creole come from, uh, Louisiana Creole, all of those different type papiamento, which is spoken in the ABC Islands in the Caribbean. Um, so we're going to go a little bit into my history. Okay, those that know and those that don't know, I'm born in the United States. I'm probably like third or fourth generation American. Basically, my lineage is directly to the Dominican Republic. That is where my ancestors came from prior to coming to the United States. So that is my bloodline. Also, that was cross verified through DNA tests. Um, I'll get into that later. But basically, my history goes back to the Dominican Republic on the island of Hispaniola, which is located in the Caribbean. So, my ancestors, my African ancestors, were brought there as slaves in the early 1500s, of course, by the Spaniards, from what's now known as the Republic of Angola in southwestern Africa. Um, Prior to the slaves coming to my island, there were people who were already there, who they talk about in our history books, the people who Columbus had met when he came to our shores. And these people are who are the Taino Native Americans, who were the indigenous original people of the whole Caribbean, from Jamaica, Cuba, Barbados. All those islands were inhabited by the Taino Indians, which is a branch of the Arawak Indians from South America, from Venezuela. Um, a lot of the African slaves and the Taino Indians, they cohabitated, they mixed in, and of course with the Spaniards. So basically, we're made up of all three different things. Um, I mean, my brown skin. It's obvious. The African and the Taino is obvious. My features, not that phenotype defines, but of course, a Spaniard doesn't have these phenotypes. So my phenotypes must be developed from my Taino and my Angolan lineages. So this goes back to Fat Joe's comment. that a lot of people I see have taken offense to when he says that most, uh, basically, basically, I am of the African diaspora. The African diaspora is basically areas outside of the continent of Africa where there are people who have uh, any type of African blood, whether it was from willful migration or whether it was from slavery or whatever the case it was from. Now, however, I'm not African American, and a lot of people, especially African Americans, get offended when a person of Caribbean, Latino, or African descent, heritage, uh, affirms that or rejects the term African American. First, we have to understand what is African American. African American is not an ethnicity, it is not a race, it's not a nationality, none of those. And mind you, all three of those things are different. Um, because it is a known fact that most African Americans that is not a monogamous group genetically or biologically. They all come from different parts of Africa. You know what I mean? So they're not all related or somehow of the same stock. That's not true. You know, one of my friends who are African American might be of Cameroonian descent. The other one might be of Nigerian descent, or whatever, the Congo, or what have you. So, and even in one country in Africa, you might have 100 different races or ethnicities. So everybody are not the same. So um, with when it comes to Latin Americans, I by experience, most non-Latino uh, people from the United States, of especially of African descent, tend to not be properly educated on culture as a whole, on culture, on African culture, on Caribbean culture, on Latino culture. I think that's very important because it all correlates. I don't think that you can study Black history without studying Caribbean and Latin American history because it all ties in. Because, like I said, slavery, African slavery, transatlantic African slavery began in Latin America, point blank range. So it has to start there in order to really um, get a full understanding, or at least a near full understanding of the history of the Americas in relation to Africans and natives. And the new group called the Latinos, or Hispanics, Caribbeans, or whatever you want to call it. So, with that being said, I think it is safe to say, and this is not to be divisive or to create some type of divisive tool in no way, shape, or form or fashion, but I do say, and I agree, that African culture is a lot prevalent in Caribbean and Latin American culture than it would be in African American culture or in United States culture, period. I say that the only group that has been in the United States from slavery who are actually still tied to their African heritage would be the Gullah people who are in South Carolina. They still speak their dialects in which was spoken during the slavery times and pre-slavery and back in Africa. So we have to keep that in mind. I have friends, for instance, who make comments like, "Oh, um, Hispanic people or Latino people or no other people can relate to Black American people, especially when it comes to the struggle, when it comes to racism, when it comes to slavery." And I beg to differ. I actually had a big debate about that, and I had to educate my friends about that. For one, again, it goes back to the history. He didn't know that Latin Americans are, in fact, products of African slavery, too, even the pale skinned ones. Even the pale skinned ones have African blood. And in fact, when people do their DNA, it comes a lot of the pale people or the ones who look less black ish tend to have more African DNA than a dark person in the United States. The dark people in the United States have a great amount, an exceptional amount of European ancestry, European blood, also Native American blood, more than their African. So it is safe to say that Caribbean Latinos and Latinos as a whole have more more African heritage. Whether they acknowledge it or not, because you do have some Latinos who don't, they know, they're very aware of their different backgrounds as far as African and Native. Some tend to not care too much for it, but most of us do. Most of us will tell you that, okay, yes, I am of African ancestry. I do have African ancestry within my DNA. Now, the problematic equation comes in when Americans tend to expect us to say identifying to Black American or African American, like to hold that title. Like I said, that there's no such thing as an African American. That title came about in 1988. It was coined by Jesse Jackson when he ran for president. Because think about it, Black Americans called themselves different things over. It changes with the time. Before they were calling themselves African American, they were calling themselves Black or Negro. Before that, they were called colored. For that, mulattoes. What does mulatto means? It means mixture of African and European ancestry. That's mulatto. Period. So it go. So though lexicon changes with the time. Um, but one thing that does not change is scientific fact. There is biologically no such thing as a black, white person or an African American person. Um, that's why it's important to learn your heritage through doing your DNA, digging more into your family history. I mean, as much as possible through land deeds, immigration records, and so forth and so forth. My first ancestor, my first Dominican ancestor that came to the United States was in the early 1900s. They came to New York through Ellis Island. Okay, so my family has been in the United States since the early 1900s. So that means my grandma and my great grandparent were here in the United States. That's where my story in the United States starts. Okay, before that, it was all on the island. Um, so they brought with them various African. Actually, some of my family, it took me so many years to um, compile a lot of. It took me so many years of research to really like put things together as far as my own personal history, my family history, and I come to find that. And mind you, out of all of my mom's kids, I'm the first one and the only one to really dig into my family history and find, okay, exactly what my history is, where they come from, when they came to the United States, where in Africa my slave ancestors came from when they came to the Caribbean. Uh, so, and I like to share that information with people because a lot of people, even Latinos, are not aware of their own history. That's why a lot of Latinos just identify with the colonial master, like Spaniard. Spaniard is, of course, part of my heritage. That's part of my heritage, undeniable. So, I just invite people to educate themselves more on culture because I feel, based on a lot of comments and viewpoints of a lot of Americans, especially African Americans, very misinformed, especially when it comes to culture, let alone not knowing the difference between nationality and ethnicity. There is a big difference. Like people tend to ask me a lot of times, what's your nationality? Um, and their meaning, what's your race or what's your ethnic background? And I tend to tell them, oh, you mean my ethnicity? My nationality is American because nationality, it has nothing to do with ethnicity or biology. Nationality is basically where you were born and or where you have citizenship. So that has nothing to do with ethnicity. So for instance, if a person says they're Nigerian, that's their nationality. Now, if you ask a Nigerian, what is your ethnicity? They'll tell you, oh, I'm Igbo, or I'm Ashanti, oh, I'm Fulani. You see things like that. Or you have somebody from Namibia. Um, Namibian is a nationality. That's just that's the name of the country. That's the political identifier to a certain land. Okay, so you say Namibian, that's your nationality. Okay, what is my wife's ethnicity? Her ethnicity is Ovamba or Oshiwambo. That's her ethnicity. That's why you notice people who immigrate to the United States from the African continent never identify as African American because, for one, Africa is not a country. It is not. It, it's just a continent. Okay, of how many different countries? And each country has many, 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 many different ethnic groups or races, whatever you want to call it, populations. So, that being said, everybody from Nigeria are not of the same genetic makeup. Because you have, like I said, you have somebody who's Fulani, then you have somebody who's Igbo, you have somebody who is Ashanti, whatever the case may be. So that's why when most people from Africa migrate to the United States or anywhere, they would say, I am Ethiopian American. I'm Nigerian American. You see? I'm Cameroon American. I'm Senegal American. I'm Senegalese American. I'm Egyptian American, Moroccan American, things like that. Even Europeans, they never say I'm come here. The ones from Europe, not the ones who's been here like 300-400 years, not them. I'm talking about the ones who come recently from Europe. They never identify as white or white American or European American. They identify as I'm British, I'm French American, I'm Italian American, I'm Spanish American, uh, you know, Dutch American, Swedish American, things like that. So it's like it's only people who were born and raised in the United States who tend to be misinformed on culture, and the real uh, formality of the whole shits, right? So even down most, if you ask most Americans, is nationality and ethnicity do the same thing? Most of them will tell you yes. They don't know the difference. So that's why I feel compelled to do this video, um, to perhaps try to educate people because I get the ignorant comments all the time. I get all of the uneducated um, comments and responses, and it's saddening because a lot of the people that make those uneducated comments on culture are some of the main ones that look at themselves as woke or conscious, Afrocentric and all that. I mean, I used to subscribe to the Afrocentric propaganda, especially by upbringing, Nation of Islam, 5% Nation. I'm 5%. I'm God body. My foundation was the Nation of Islam. That's how I was introduced to knowledge of self and the lessons. Some God body. Peace to the true and living gods and earth, in fact. are coming in the attribute of divine, born scientific law. So I definitely have knowledge of self. Um, um, Again, I'm not Afrocentric. I used to subscribe to the Afrocentric propaganda. However, I found that that is misinformation, and it is in fact not different from white supremacist ideologies. It's just on the opposite side of the spectrum. That's all. It's just like Democrats and Republicans, both the same master, just two opposite sides of the spectrum. The Democrats, they they root for more spending for social programs. The Republican root for more higher spending for more industrialized military complex wars and stuff. But at the end of the day, they both are about overspending for their own interests. So it's all the same. It's the same with Afrocentrics and white supremacists. They both feel that their group is the best or the first here, the dominant, and they even use certain pseudoscience bullshit to try to justify or to try to back up their claims. Like Afrocentrics, they use the one drop rule and turn it into something positive to basically back up their claims to say, oh, well, the black gene is dominant over all other genes. Well, if that was so, why do you have sometimes children being born to a black and a white parent, but they come out, less African looking? Okay. The African gene is always dominant, then it would be in all cases. So that is not true. Again, that is another black supremacy thing. It's the same as white supremacy. That's why I don't treat black racists any different from a white racist. They're all the same to me. I'm not biased when it comes to that. I don't have a drop of racism in me, or ethnic bias. I treat everybody the same unless they prove otherwise. So I hope that you guys have, in fact, grasp something, or at least, to say the least, this video sparked something to compel you to want to educate yourself more on culture. Because, like I said, there's a serious epidemic of miseducation in the United States when it comes to culture, especially when it comes to African Americans, so-called African Americans, and even Latinos. So hope you guys enjoyed the video. Like, comment, so forth and so forth. I will be doing another video soon, so tune in, stay tuned. Have a good day.